Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys know how this works. You give us the sources, and we take a look and bring you the most interesting parts.
That's right.
So today we're looking at this book.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Underlaying Logic.
Which translates to the underlying logic.
Okay, Underlying Logic.
Yeah.
Written by Lou Run. What's this book about?
Well, covers a lot of ground, but basically it's about understanding the hidden logic of how the world works. Not just sort of surface level stuff, but like giving you actual mental models you can use.
Interesting.
It gets into personal growth, business strategy, even the origin of the measurement meter, which is kind of a fun little tidbit.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're covering quite a bit in this one.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
To kick things off, this book dives right into 3 different ways to judge right and wrong.
Uh-huh.
And it all starts with, kind of a gripping story about a wealthy man whose son gets kidnapped.
Right. Kind of a high-stakes situation. Yeah, pretty intense. So you would expect, like, panic, right? But the father remains calm.
And when they ask him why he's so calm, he says, "This time, I was wrong."
This time I was wrong.
Yeah, and it seems like a strange reaction, but it actually points to this brilliant idea of separating your problem from everyone else's problem.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does that work?
Well, the book uses this analogy of like a lawyer, an economist, and a business person, each looking at the same situation. It's a thought experiment.
Okay, so like 3 different perspectives.
Exactly. So the lawyer, they're going to look at it through the lens of the law. Right. Like who broke the law? In this case, obviously the kidnapper.
Right.
The economist is thinking about like cost to society. Maybe the community didn't invest enough in security, so that's partly to blame.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
But the business person, and this is where the father's perspective comes in, is focused on who has the most to learn from this situation.
In this case, the father.
Right. Exactly. He's the one who has the most to lose, and therefore the most to gain by figuring out how to prevent something like this from happening again.
Okay, so it's not about shifting blame. It's about taking responsibility.
Exactly. And that's a huge shift in thinking, right? Instead of pointing fingers, you're looking inward. And honestly, I think that's a really valuable lesson for anyone in any situation.
Absolutely. It makes you think, like, have I ever blamed someone else when I was the one who could have done something differently?
Right. Like, what could I have learned from that experience?
This framework is about taking ownership and finding those crucial lessons, turning a negative into, an opportunity for growth.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us to the next big concept from the book, which is this hierarchy of humanity, morality, and law.
Okay, that sounds deep. Break it down for us.
All right. So think of it as 3 levels. At the very bottom, you have humanity.
Okay.
And this is like our basic instincts.
Like survival and stuff.
Exactly. Survival, reproduction, things like that. It's not inherently good or bad, just, part of what makes us human.
Right.
Then, as we develop as a society, we come up with morality. These are like the social contracts, the rules we agree on to make sure everybody thrives, for the greater good.
Okay, so morality is kind of like restraining those basic instincts for, like, a better society.
Exactly. It's recognizing that sometimes what's good for the individual might not be good for the group. And then at the very top, you have law.
Right.
And law is basically the enforceable minimum of what we consider moral, like the absolute bottom line of acceptable behavior.
So the law is like the bare minimum to keep society functioning.
Exactly. But the interesting thing that Underlaying Logic points out is that sometimes doing what's legal might feel morally wrong, and vice versa.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a real ethical dilemma.
It is. Like, imagine you see someone being treated unfairly. Legally, you might not be obligated to intervene.
But morally, you might feel like you have to do something?
Right. Or think about laws that were once considered acceptable, but now are seen as totally immoral. Understanding these 3 levels, like humanity, morality, law, it helps us navigate those gray areas.
Gives us framework for, like, ethical decision-making.
Exactly.
Interesting. I'm sure our listeners can think of a few examples, too. Any come to mind for you?
Well, whistleblowers, for example.
Yeah.
They might be breaking the law to expose something they believe is morally wrong.
Yeah, good point.
Or, think about like historical examples, like laws that allowed slavery or discrimination. Those were legal at the time, but obviously deeply immoral.
Right. Understanding these different levels can help us understand how those things happen, maybe even prevent them from happening again.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices, not just blindly following rules.
And speaking of choices, let's switch gears to something a bit more personal.
Okay.
This book talks about 3 levels of wisdom for life.
Right. It's like a roadmap for personal development.
And they build on each other. So at the highest level, level 3, we have game theory.
Yep.
Ooh, game theory. That sounds strategic.
Oh, it definitely is. Think negotiations, understanding other people's motivations, seeking win-win situations.
It's like seeing the bigger picture, playing the long game.
Exactly. It's about being strategic in your thinking and actions.
So then what's level 2 all about?
Level 2 is focus. It's about tuning out distractions, having the discipline to think long-term, saying no to opportunities that don't really align with your goals.
Okay. So if level 3 is strategic thinking, level 2 is like focused action. What's that foundation? What's level 1?
Level 1 is the most basic, but it's also the most important. It's simply recognizing that you have choices.
Oh.
Even when life throws curveballs, you always have a choice. And then having the courage to make those choices and own the consequences.
That's pretty powerful stuff, taking responsibility for your life and your decisions. So listener, at what level do you usually operate? Are there areas where you could level up? It's a good self-reflection exercise.
Right. It's all about continuous improvement, always striving to become a little bit wiser. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of logic, there's one more thing I want to talk about.
Okay, go for it.
This book talks about this manipulative technique, and it's something we should all be aware of. It's called the why injection.
Why injection? Sounds sneaky. What is that?
It's really subtle, but it can be pretty potent. It's basically when someone plants an idea in your mind by phrasing it as a why question.
Okay, I'm not sure I get it. Can you give us an example?
Sure. Let's say someone is complaining that their product isn't selling, right? And they ask, why do people only buy cheap, low-quality stuff?
Ah, I see. By asking why, they're implying that people do only buy cheap stuff, even if that's not necessarily true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because our brains are wired to answer why questions, we might just accept that premise without really thinking it through.
It's like they're planting that belief in your mind without you even realizing it.
Exactly. And it could be used for all sorts of things, like spreading rumors, like why did that celebrity do that horrible thing?
Or even to avoid responsibility, like a boss saying, why are all the good employees so hard to find these days?
Right. It's shifting blame without explicitly saying it. Di-Cheng Luoji wants us to be aware of this tactic. It's about protecting yourself from manipulation.
Both from others and from those limiting beliefs we sometimes create for ourselves.
Absolutely.
Okay, this is a real game changer. I'm going to be paying much closer attention to why questions from now on.
Me too.
Now, let's dive into the heart of logical thinking.
All right, let's do it.
Because this book goes way beyond the basics.
It does. It introduces these 4 really powerful phrases for rock-solid reasoning.
Ooh, lay 'em on us. What's the first one?
The first one is, prove existence, don't disprove non-existence.
Okay, so if I see one black swan, that disproves the statement, all swans are white, right?
Exactly. One counterexample can shatter a generalization. The second phrase is, don't generalize from the particular.
Okay.
So just because one rich person dropped out of college, it doesn't mean that education is worthless.
Right. You need to look for broader patterns, not just isolated incidents. Okay, what's number 3?
Number 3 is proof of existence relies on examples.
Okay.
So if you're claiming that something exists, you got to back it up with evidence. Don't just make a claim without anything to support it.
Makes sense. Don't just tell me, show me. All right, and the final phrase, what's number 4?
Number 4 is generalization relies on reasoning.
Okay.
So broad statements.
And on that note, let's move on to the next section. Okay, so we left off talking about logic. And this book goes even deeper with this idea of closed loops.
Yeah, these closed loops are basically levels of how deeply someone can think.
Oh, okay. Levels.
Yeah, it's kind of like a way to assess their logical thinking,
I love a good framework. Break it down for us. What are these levels?
Right, so at the most basic level, level 1, there's no real closed loop at all. It's just like scattered thoughts.
Yeah.
Bouncing around between ideas without any real connection.
Sounds kind of chaotic.
Yeah, it is. It's very chaotic. And then we move up to level 2, where there's some logical reasoning, but it's not consistent.
So they can follow a line of thinking, but they don't have a solid system.
Exactly. They might make a logical point in one instance, but then contradict themselves later because there's no overarching framework,
Okay, so what about level 3?
Level 3 is where a closed loop starts to form, but it's at a low level.
What do you mean?
Think of it like having a really limited perspective. Like they can't see beyond their own experiences and biases.
Like they're trapped in their own little echo chamber.
Exactly. They've created this closed loop of logic, but it's limited by their own narrow viewpoint, right? So they might reject any new information that challenges their existing beliefs.
So how do you break free from that echo chamber? How do you get to a higher level?
Well, that's level 4. And this is where the closed loop starts to become more sophisticated, right?
Yeah.
So they're insightful, they're knowledgeable, but there's still a potential pitfall.
What's that?
They can be resistant to new information, especially if it challenges their carefully constructed mental model,
Oh, yeah, I know a few people like that. They've built this intricate system for understanding the world, but it can be a little too rigid, too fixed.
Right. They might cling to their beliefs even when presented with, like, really strong evidence to the contrary.
It's like that saying, my mind is made up. Don't confuse me with the facts. So what's the ideal? What's the ultimate level of logical thinking?
That would be level 5. This is a constantly evolving, high-level, closed loop. So think of it as a dynamic system that's always open to new information. It's constantly refining its understanding, adapting as needed.
So they're like intellectual chameleons, constantly changing and blending in with the landscape of knowledge.
That's a great analogy. They embrace new data, they challenge their own assumptions, and they're always learning and growing. It's really the ideal.
Yeah, it's like always be questioning, always be seeking new information. So listeners, think about it. Which level do you operate at? What are some signs that you might be stuck at a lower level?
Right. It's a great self-awareness exercise to kind of think about where you're at and where you can improve.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit now and talk about something that, I think a lot of people think they understand.
Okay.
Compounding.
Compounding. Yeah, it's a concept that everyone throws around.
But the underlying logic has, like, a really unique take on it.
It does. It starts by kind of dispelling some common misconceptions.
Oh, I love when a book calls me out on my assumptions.
It makes you realize you might not understand it as well as you thought.
Okay, so what are some of those misconceptions about compounding?
Well, a lot of people think that it only applies to, like, finance, like investments growing over time.
Right. It's a very common financial term.
But this book shows that compounding is actually a much broader principle.
So it's not just about money.
No, not at all. It applies to knowledge, skills, relationships, pretty much any area of life where consistent effort over time leads to exponential growth.
So small actions repeated consistently can lead to big results down the line.
Exactly. It's like, reading a few pages each day might not seem like much, but over years, it compounds into a vast amount of knowledge.
That's a good point. I never thought about it like that.
It's the principle of consistency,
It's like that saying, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today.
Exactly. It's never too late to start, and those small efforts really do accumulate over time. Like, it's the snowball effect in action.
Okay, before we move on, I have to ask about something that really caught my eye in this book. It seemed so random, but it was actually super interesting.
What's that?
The origin of the meter.
Oh, yeah. That's one of those things you wouldn't expect to find in a book like this.
Right. It seems so out of place, but it was actually really fascinating. So tell us, how was the meter originally defined?
Well, originally it was 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator.
Wow. So it was literally tied to the Earth's circumference.
It was. But as science advanced, we needed a more precise definition. So we moved from this physical metal bar, which was like the meter prototype, to using the wavelength of light.
And now?
Now it's based on the speed of light in a vacuum, which is like this fundamental constant in the universe.
So we went from earthbound to, like, cosmic. That's pretty mind-blowing.
It is, and I think it shows how our understanding of the world is constantly evolving,
Yeah.
What we once thought was fixed and absolute can change as we gain new knowledge.
It's a good reminder to stay curious and to always be open to new ways of understanding things.
Absolutely. And this book really encourages that kind of thinking,
Yeah, for sure. So the book also talks about the connection between diligence and wealth. It argues that, hard work can lead to wealth, but
it doesn't stop there. It also raises this really important question. Do the diligents always receive their fair share?
Right. Like, is hard work always enough? It makes you think about all the other factors that are at play.
Exactly. It challenges that simple equation of, hard work equals success.
So it's about looking beyond individual effort and examining the bigger picture, right? Like, what are some of those systemic factors that might be at play?
We'll think about things like economic inequality, access to opportunities, even biases within certain systems. Someone might work incredibly hard but still struggle to get ahead because the playing field isn't level.
It's like that saying, it's not just about working hard, it's about working smart.
Right. But even working smart might not be enough if the system itself is rigged against you.
Exactly.
The underlying logic wants us to think critically about those larger forces that are shaping our lives and our chances of success.
So it's a call to action then, to examine those systems and try to make them more equitable?
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that individual effort is important, but it's not the whole story.
Well, that's definitely something to think about. And listener, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the underlying logic.
Wow, time flies when you're having fun discussing deep concepts.
It really does. So let's do a quick recap of some of the key takeaways here. First, remember those 3 different perspectives for assessing right and wrong: the legal view, the economic view, and then that crucial lesson of focusing on who has the most to learn from a situation.
Right, who has the most skin in the game.
Exactly. And then we learned about those sneaky why questions and how they can be used to manipulate us. So, listeners, stay vigilant. Don't let those sneaky whys get the best of you.
Question everything.
And let's not forget those 4 powerful phrases for building rock-solid logical thinking skills. Prove existence, don't disprove non-existence, don't generalize from the particular. Proof of existence relies on examples, and generalization relies on reasoning.
Those are tools you can use every day to cut through the noise and make sense of the world.
Absolutely. And finally, remember that idea of compounding. It's not just about money. It's about how consistent effort in any area of life can lead to amazing results over time.
Small steps, big outcomes.
Exactly. And as we learned from that story about the meter, our understanding of the world is always evolving. What we think is fixed and absolute today might be completely different tomorrow.
So stay curious, my friend.
Always keep learning, keep questioning. And on that note, we're signing off. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time. It really makes you think about like individual responsibility versus those larger forces.
Yeah. It's a big question, right? Like, how much control do we really have over our own lives?
Exactly. And I think the underlying logic doesn't necessarily provide all the answers.
Right.
But it definitely encourages us to think about it more deeply.
To be aware of those systems and how they might be influencing us.
Absolutely. And even though we might not be able to control everything,
yeah,
we can definitely advocate for change, right?
Absolutely. We can use our voices, our actions to try to create a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. So it's not just about understanding how the world works, but also about like using that knowledge to try to make it better.
Right. That's a great takeaway. So listener, as you go about your day today, think about that question that the book raises. If diligence can indeed create wealth, as the book suggests, what are some of those systems or models that might prevent the diligent from always receiving their fair share?
Right. Like, what are those roadblocks that might be standing in their way, even if they're working incredibly hard?
It's a complex issue. There's no easy answer, but it's definitely worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And that, I think, is the beauty of this book. It gives you these mental models, these frameworks, but it also challenges you to think for yourself, to apply them to the real world, and to, maybe even come up with your own answers.
Yeah, I love that. It's not just giving you the answers, it's teaching you how to think.
Exactly.
Well, listener, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the underlying logic.
It's been a journey.
It really has. We've covered so much ground, from, different ways to judge right and wrong, to the levels of logical thinking, that sneaky why injection, the power of compounding, even the origin of the meter.
That was a fun one.
It was. Who knew that the meter had such a fascinating backstory?
Right. It just goes to show you never know what you're going to find when you start digging deeper.
Exactly. So, listener, we hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. We hope it's giving you some new insights, some food for thought, and maybe even some tools to help you navigate the complexities of life.
And to think a little bit more logically.
Absolutely. So, until next time, keep those brains buzzing, keep those questions coming, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.